6:30 in the morning, on the 27th of August, the world held its breath in Addis Ababa. Before hundreds of journalists, before dozens of world leaders, one man stood unflinching. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso looked not to the side, not to the floor, but directly into the eye of history. His words did not tremble. His voice did not bend. He declared, with the clarity of thunder, "You have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here." It was not the language of war. It was not the whisper of compromise. It was a trumpet of dignity. And in that hall, silence became the loudest sound on earth. Beloved friends, this is more than politics. This is about sovereignty that cannot be pawned, dignity that cannot be bought, and a people who refuse to bow. This story is a sermon carved out of struggle, courage, and faith. So I ask you, if you believe in voices that rise against the odds, if you believe Africa's dignity must be heard, then press subscribe, ring that bell, and share this journey. Together, we do not just watch history, we shape it. The hour was early, yet the atmosphere was electric. The African Development Summit in Addis Ababa was meant to be another carefully choreographed gathering of polite speeches and predictable statements. Delegates expected the usual: statistics about trade, cautious notes about cooperation, the same promises recycled once more. But instead, the air split open. At 6:30, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, not with a sheaf of papers, not with a rehearsed smile, but with the bearing of a man carrying the weight of a continent. "Mr. Netanyahu," he said, and the name alone fell heavy, reverberating through the room. Journalists lifted their heads, fingers poised above keyboards. Some laughed nervously, expecting a gentle diplomatic jab, a passing remark. But then came the line that froze the hall. "You have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here. Not in trade, not in diplomacy, not in history." In that moment, the ordinary became extraordinary. Leaders who had traveled the world over, men and women accustomed to protocol and euphemism, looked to one another in disbelief. They knew they were witnessing something rare, unfiltered defiance, stripped of diplomatic sugar. It was not a threat of armies. It was not the saber-rattling of force. It was, as one elder minister whispered, a strike of dignity. Yet to understand the fire that burned in those words, one must step back. The ultimatum did not come out of a vacuum. It was the fruit of a leak, a poisoned seed, planted in the secrecy of a G7 meeting. According to diplomatic whispers, the Israeli Prime Minister had belittled African leaders, calling them naive, opportunistic, even theatrical in their criticism of the Gaza campaign. And worse, he had hinted at tightening the chains of debt through international lenders, as if sovereignty could be mortgaged, as if the dignity of nations could be repossessed like furniture. When the leak surfaced, African media erupted. On radio talk shows in Lagos, in cafes in Nairobi, in newsrooms in Accra, fury spread like wildfire. On social networks, the phrase, "Africa is not your pawn," began trending, echoing through millions of posts. And yet, while anger boiled, Traoré himself chose silence. For days, he said nothing. He allowed the storm to build. That silence was not a weakness. It was the silence before a drumbeat, the silence before the preacher lifts his hand, the silence before thunder cracks the sky. So when he rose in Addis Ababa, when his voice rolled across microphones and cameras, it was not just his voice. It was the collective breath of a continent finding its lungs. It was centuries of dismissal and insult answered in a single sentence. In Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Johannesburg, people stopped what they were doing to replay the clip. Students in Accra cheered in their classrooms. Market women in Dakar repeated the line as though it was scripture. "You have 48 hours." The phrase became a refrain, a hymn of resistance, a drumbeat of dignity. And yet, in the stillness of that hall, there was more than celebration. There was unease, because in that moment, a question was born. What would become of such defiance? Could a small nation like Burkina Faso truly call a giant to account? Was this courage, or was it the prelude to peril? As the cameras panned across the faces of diplomats, one could see the split. Some eyes gleamed with admiration, others narrowed with calculation. And while the applause was hesitant, the silence spoke louder. For every second that ticked by, the countdown had already begun. But as the echoes of his ultimatum rolled across continents, another drama unfolded, not in the speeches, but in the reactions. For it is one thing to speak boldly, and another to face the tempest that speech unleashes. What storm was about to break? When the words left Captain Ibrahim Traore's lips, they did not remain confined within the marble walls of the Addis Ababa summit. They traveled. They flew across continents faster than any diplomat's plane, faster than any courier's message. Within minutes, the ultimatum was clipped, subtitled, and streamed into homes, cafes, and classrooms around the globe. In South Africa, the foreign minister reposted the viral clip with a single sentence. Finally, someone said it. In Kenya, a former ambassador to the United Nations declared that this was the dawn of a new African diplomacy, fearless, incorruptible, unashamed. On social media, the hashtag #Africa is not your porn became a wildfire. It was not just an online slogan, it was a rallying cry. From government chambers to university forums, from rural villages to diaspora communities in London and Kingston, the line repeated like a chant. For the first time in decades, Africa's voice was not a murmur in the corner of world politics. It was center stage, and Traoré was not seen merely as the president of a landlocked West African nation. He was seen as a herald, a modern-day Sankara, a young soldier standing tall where others bowed. Yet beyond the praise, there was strategy. Israel's government issued a vague denial of the leaked comments, but avoided answering the ultimatum directly. That silence did not calm the storm, it fed it. Analysts on African channels declared that the denial was proof enough. Africa's dignity had once again been brushed aside. In the United States, reactions were divided. In Washington, some voices called the move reckless, a gambit that could destabilize fragile alliances. But in Harlem, in Atlanta, in Los Angeles, a different spirit stirred. African-American scholars, pastors, and activists saw something else. Clarity, not chaos. At Howard University, students gathered in an impromptu forum, debating what it meant to hear an African leader declare without stammer or apology that respect is non-negotiable. Across campuses, classrooms turned into pulpits, and the question rose, was this not the kind of defiance their own ancestors longed to see? And then came the streets. In Harlem, thousands gathered, waving the flags of Burkina Faso alongside the stars and stripes. The chants were loud, rhythmic, almost liturgical. Africa stands tall. Africa stands proud. Portraits of Thomas Sankara mingled with images of Traoré, past and present, converging into a single vision. Elders who had marched in civil rights parades wept, seeing in this moment a reflection of battles long fought and yet unfinished. Beyond America, the wave rolled on. Moscow and Beijing amplified the story, casting Traoré as a symbol of defiance against Western dominance. European leaders, more cautious, urged dialogue but betrayed unease in their tone. In the Middle East, governments split, some condemning the ultimatum as a provocation, others quietly admiring the audacity of a small African state standing tall before a great power. Meanwhile, Traoré himself chose silence once again. He had spoken once, and that was enough. His stillness forced the world to wrestle with his words, to fill the silence with speculation, to measure their own response. It was a masterstroke, for in diplomacy, sometimes silence shouts louder than speeches. And as the 48-hour clock ticked, whispers began of backroom maneuvers. Reporters spoke of Israeli envoys, reaching out through third parties, seeking clarification, searching for a way to cool the fire without bending the knee. There were no official statements, only rumors, but the timing was telling. For the first time, one of the most entrenched powers of the world was being compelled to pause, because a voice from Africa had commanded it so. The preacher's question hung in the air. Can a people be free without respect? The answer, chanted in markets and mosques, in classrooms and cathedrals, was the same. No! But every wave, no matter how high, must crash upon a shore. And as the world echoed with support and speculation, a sobering question arose. What would be the true consequences of this ultimatum, both for Burkina Faso and for Africa itself? The wave of applause, the chorus of hashtags, the street marches with banners high. These were only the opening movements. For every roar of support, there came the quieter, weightier matter of consequence. A bold ultimatum is not a sermon sung into the air. It is a seed planted in the soil of reality. And soil, as every farmer in Burkina Faso knows, gives back both fruit and thorns. Inside Burkina Faso, the effect was immediate. Communities fractured by conflict found a sudden unity in the echo of Traoré's words. In villages scarred by insurgency, elders told children around fire pits that Africa had spoken with one voice. Even in camps of the displaced, people repeated the phrase 48 hours, as if it were a promise of better days. Support for Traoré swelled beyond the army barracks and government chambers. Opposition parties, once quick to criticize his military-led rule, began to hesitate. To attack him now risked appearing unpatriotic, out of step with the pulse of the people. The numbers bore witness. Surveys revealed that where once only a minority accepted military rule, now a clear majority endorsed his leadership. In the minds of many, Traoré was no longer simply a transitional head of state. He was a defender of dignity, a figure cast in the lineage of Thomas Sankara. To his supporters, he was not just a politician, he was a symbol. But symbols carry weight, and weight brings risk. Economists warned that the ultimatum might scare off investors. International financial institutions whispered of sanctions, of funding withheld, of projects frozen. In corridors of power from Brussels to Washington, the question was not only about Africa's pride, it was about Africa's economic ties. Could Burkina Faso, a nation already wrestling with insurgency and hardship, afford to defy the tide? This tension spilled into the African Union. For years, critics had mocked the AU as slow, reactive, and cautious. But in those fateful hours, there was movement. Leaders debated whether to issue a united statement, to turn Traore's lone cry into a continental demand. Parliaments in South Africa, Namibia, and Tanzania considered revisiting trade agreements with Israel, weighing dignity against dependency. And yet, the strongest consequence was not in boardrooms or resolutions. It was in the hearts of ordinary people. Students across West Africa drafted petitions demanding that their governments support Burkina Faso. Market vendors in Ghana pasted handwritten signs reading "Respect Africa" above their stalls. From Accra to Lagos, pastors and imams alike wove the ultimatum into their sermons, declaring that sovereignty is not a bargaining chip, but a birthright. But here too lay danger. High expectations can soar faster than reality can deliver. If no apology came, if no visible shift followed, the same fire that burned bright in unity could cool into disappointment. And in the volatile climate of the Sahel, disappointment has a cost. The phrase Burkina Faso news appeared again and again in headlines, signaling not just a story of one nation, but a mirror for the entire continent. What would it mean if the ultimatum ended in silence? Would it weaken the hope it ignited, or would it deepen the conviction that Africa must walk its own path, regardless of response? For all the celebration, questions lingered like storm clouds. Could Traore's domestic reforms, nationalizing mines, building refineries, arming farmers with tractors, carry the weight of his foreign boldness? Could his military government maintain popularity while grappling with the harsh realities of conflict, poverty, and displacement? And could a single ultimatum truly redraw the lines of global diplomacy? Question for viewers: what do you believe? A public apology is enough? Or must there be a structural change in how Africa is respected on the world stage? Leave your answer in the comments below. For even as the 48 hours drew closer to their end, one truth loomed: every ultimatum has a price. And the question hanging over Africa was simple, yet perilous. Who would pay it? The ultimatum did not belong to Burkina Faso alone. It was a stone dropped into the waters of world politics, and the ripples reached every shore. In the United States, analysts on cable news argued late into the night. Some labeled Traore's words reckless, the kind of rhetoric that could fracture alliances in a region already fragile. But others, especially a younger generation of African-American scholars, saw something else. To them, this was not recklessness, it was revelation. A leader speaking the truth without apology, standing upright where so many had bowed. On campuses, from Howard to UCLA, classrooms became pulpits of debate. Students spoke of dignity, of sovereignty, of a voice long silenced, now speaking clearly. In Harlem, the response was not theoretical. It was flesh and blood. Diaspora communities marched with flags of both America and Burkina Faso. They chanted not for isolation, but for respect. They demanded that cooperation with Africa be built not on pity, not on hierarchy, but on mutual recognition. Elders who once marched for civil rights wiped their eyes, saying, "We never thought we'd live to see this day." Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, state media embraced the moment. Commentators hailed Traoré as proof that the Global South could challenge Western dominance. They painted the ultimatum as more than one man's words, as the birth of a new diplomatic era. In Europe, the reaction was measured, but uneasy. Leaders in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels spoke of dialogue, but beneath their restraint was an unspoken fear. The balance of influence in Africa was shifting. The old ways of negotiation, lectures given, instructions issued, were crumbling. And in the Middle East, reactions split. Some called Traore's challenge a provocation. Others, behind closed doors, admired the audacity of a small African nation forcing a giant to pause. The preacher's voice asks, what is the currency of 21st century diplomacy? Is it still military might, still financial leverage, or has dignity itself become the coin that buys respect? For if dignity is now the new measure, then the world must answer, who is willing to pay the price of respect and who will demand it, whatever the cost? The 48 hours came and went. No apology was offered, yet something had shifted. In the stillness after the deadline, the true weight of the ultimatum revealed itself, not in the words of Netanyahu, but in the transformed conversation across Africa and beyond. For many, the lack of apology mattered less than the fact that the world had been forced to listen. Africa had spoken without trembling, and the echo could not be erased. But echoes fade if they are not followed by footsteps. The question became, what comes next? Some envisioned a new diplomacy of self-reliance. They pointed to Traore's domestic reforms, nationalizing gold mines, building Burkina Faso's first refinery, placing tractors in the hands of farmers, as the foundation of a future where Africa does not beg for partnership but builds it on its own terms. Others urged caution, reminding that bold words must be matched by stability, by peace in the Sahel, by the daily bread of ordinary citizens. Regional blocs, too, began to stir. ECOWAS, long focused on economics and conflict resolution, debated whether it was time to adopt a stronger voice in global politics. The African Union, often accused of slowness, now found itself pressed to move with urgency, to prove that Africa's unity was not just rhetorical, but practical. And among the diaspora, the ultimatum was not a closed chapter, but an open door. African American leaders called for deeper cultural and economic bridges. Caribbean voices spoke of shared history, shared dignity, shared destiny. From Harlem to Kingston, the call was the same. If Africa builds its own table, then its children abroad must bring their chairs and sit with pride. Yet the risks remain. Investors may hesitate, sanctions may loom, enemies may exploit the turbulence. Every step forward will demand resilience, sacrifice, and unshakable faith. The preacher's cadence reminds us, the wilderness is long, but it is not endless. The promised land of dignity lies beyond the trials. And so, the road ahead is not only for Ibrahim Traore, it is for Africa entirely. The ultimatum was a spark. The future must be the fire. But as the sun rises over the Sahel and the dust of history settles, one final question lingers. Will this moment be remembered as a passing storm or as the dawn of a new era? In the end, the ultimatum was not about 48 hours. It was about centuries. Centuries of voices silenced, of sovereignty dismissed, of dignity treated as disposable. And yet, in Addis Ababa, one young leader declared that the days of dismissal are done. The world may debate whether Netanyahu apologized, but Africa already knows the deeper truth. The balance of power has shifted in spirit, if not yet in structure. This is where history meets prophecy. For when Ibrahim Traore stood tall, he was not alone. Behind him stood the unbroken line of ancestors, the struggles of liberation, the marches of civil rights, the whispered prayers of mothers who dreamed of freedom. His words carried more than politics. They carried the weight of memory and the promise of tomorrow. The headlines call it Ibrahim Traore news. But to millions, it is not just news, it is testimony. Testimony that Africa no longer waits for recognition. Testimony that dignity cannot be granted, only claimed. And in that testimony lies the power to shape generations. The Burkina Faso news of this ultimatum will fade from front pages. Yet the question it raised will remain. Will Africa continue to build its own table? Or will it once again be forced to sit as a guest at another's? The answer does not belong only to presidents or parliaments. It belongs to the people, to farmers and teachers, to students and elders, to the diaspora scattered across oceans but bound by memory. So I turn to you, beloved viewers. In your own life, when did you choose to stand rather than bow? What did it cost you, and what did it give you? Share your story in the comments, for in your words lies the chorus of this journey. And I ask you, with urgency and with hope, press subscribe, share this message, let the fire of dignity spread. Each click, each comment, each share is a brick in the table Africa builds for itself. The world may call it Ibrahim Traore news, but for us, it is more. It is the gospel of sovereignty, the sermon of dignity, and the prophecy that Africa stands tall, not tomorrow, not someday, but now.